I dedicated over a decade of my life to my parents' business. I practically grew up in the office, learning the ropes, managing projects, keeping the company afloat when times got tough. Every decision I made, every late night I spent, every client I kept happy, it was all for the family business. I believed that loyalty, hard work, and sacrifice meant something to them. Then, one day, everything I thought I knew about loyalty was shattered. I walked into the office on a Monday morning, expecting to finalize a major deal that could save us from a looming financial crisis. Instead, I was met with my mother's cold stare and my father's clipped words. "We've decided to let you go. We think it's time for a new direction." I blinked, stunned. My brother, who had spent years avoiding responsibilities, showing up late, and barely contributing anything meaningful to the company, was suddenly being praised as a natural leader. They told me he was going to take over some of my responsibilities. I tried to argue, to remind them of the countless nights I worked while they slept soundly, but it was like speaking into a void. I packed up my things in silence. The office that had been my second home now felt like a cage I had outgrown. Walking out, I felt a cocktail of emotions: anger, betrayal, heartbreak, disbelief. I had given everything to these people, only to be tossed aside for someone less capable, someone who had coiled in the comfort of their parents' privilege instead of climbing the trenches like I had. The worst part wasn't even the firing itself. It was the way they tried to frame it as a favor to me. "You'll thank us one day," my father said. "You need to find your own path." My own path? My entire life had been built around their company, their dreams, their expectations. And suddenly, I was supposed to just find something else? For months, I grappled with my anger and grief. Friends tried to comfort me, telling me it was an opportunity, a chance to step out on my own. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wanted them to recognize my worth, to admit they made a mistake. I wanted my parents, the people who had given me life, to see the injustice they had inflicted on me. Then, as time passed, I watched in disbelief as their company began to crumble. Projects fell behind, clients complained, profits dipped. I could have warned them, stepped in, offered my expertise, but why should I? Why should the child they dismissed out of hand be the one to save them from the mess they created? And yet, part of me still ached. Family was supposed to mean something, but I realized that maybe loyalty had limits, and love didn't always guarantee fairness. The seeds of a choice were planted in me. I could step in and save them, or I could let the empire they built fall into my hands, through a company I would later lead, one that could swallow theirs whole. I never expected to find myself in that position. I never thought betrayal could lead to such a strange and powerful form of revenge or justice. And now, as I stand on the edge of deciding their fate, I can't help but ask myself, AITA? After being fired, I felt like I had lost not just a job, but a part of myself. The office, the clients, the sense of purpose. It had all been ripped away in a single brutal morning. For the first few weeks, I wandered aimlessly, trying to understand how everything I had built with my own hands could be dismissed so easily. I scrolled through old emails, revisiting project plans, client correspondence, even personal notes I had left for my parents, hoping to find some clue, some reason that could justify their betrayal. There was none. The reality hit me hard. My parents didn't value my dedication. They didn't recognize the sacrifices I had made. My brother, who had coasted through school, avoided responsibility, and taken every shortcut imaginable, had been chosen over me. It was maddening. Every time I thought I had processed it, a new wave of anger washed over me. I realized that if I wanted to survive and thrive, I couldn't rely on my parents' approval or their business. I had to start from scratch. So, I began taking freelance consulting gigs, small contracts that allowed me to stay in the industry I knew inside and out. I had to rebuild my confidence, my reputation, and most importantly, my sense of self-worth. It wasn't easy. I watched my former clients being wooed by my brother, who often mismanaged their accounts, miscommunicated deadlines, and seemed oblivious to the chaos he caused. My parents, too, were clearly struggling. Rumors began to circulate. Missed deliveries, angry emails, unpaid contractors. I could feel their empire weakening. Part of me wanted to intervene, to step in and show them that I still cared. But pride, and a deep, simmering resentment, kept me away. During this period, I also built my own network. I reached out to former colleagues, industry friends, and mentors who had always seen my potential. Slowly, I began to carve a path that was entirely my own. I learned lessons the hard way: how to negotiate contracts, how to manage teams remotely, how to handle crises without a safety net. Every mistake I made, every setback I endured, strengthened me. I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing for something bigger. Then, nearly 3 years after my firing, a competitor approached me with an offer. They were looking to expand aggressively, and my expertise and knowledge of my parents' company made me an invaluable asset. It was surreal. The company that had thrown me aside was now vulnerable, and I had the means to take advantage of it. I hesitated. This wasn't just business. It was deeply personal. Could I really step into a role where I might destroy or absorb the company my parents had built, the one I had once given my life to? My nights were restless, filled with visions of boardrooms, contracts, and the inevitable confrontation with my parents. But the anger, the betrayal, and the long years of overlooked effort had transformed into a cold clarity. I was no longer the powerless child they had dismissed. I had options. I had power. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could control my own destiny. So I began planning not a reckless takeover, but a calculated one. I learned every weakness in their operations, studied their financial statements, and quietly positioned myself within the competitor company. I wasn't just going to survive. I was preparing to lead, and eventually to make a choice that could change the trajectory of everyone involved. I still felt conflicted. Family loyalty tugged at me, but my pride and sense of justice were stronger. Watching my parents struggle from a distance was painful, but I couldn't ignore the fact that they had forced me to this point. And as the day approached when I would finally have the power to decide their fate, I kept asking myself the same haunting question: AITA for considering it? By the 4th year after my firing, it became impossible to ignore the signs. My parents' company, once a beacon of stability in the industry, was starting to unravel in ways that were both predictable and shocking. Clients were leaving in droves, citing mismanagement and poor communication. Projects that had once been completed efficiently were now consistently delayed or over budget. Suppliers began expressing frustration over late payments, and whispers of legal troubles began circulating within the industry. I watched it all unfold from a distance, partly out of curiosity, partly out of disbelief. How could a company so meticulously built, nurtured, and maintained crumble so quickly? The answer was painfully clear. My brother was ill-equipped to handle the responsibility, and my parents, blinded by favoritism, refused to intervene in meaningful ways. It was during this time that I realized how deeply I had been underestimated. The people who had fired me thought my skills were disposable, that my dedication was replaceable. And yet, here they were, watching their empire deteriorate without realizing the role I had played in keeping it afloat for so many years. Despite everything, part of me still felt a pang of sorrow. I had invested so much of myself into this family and their business. But the anger lingered, coiling tighter with each mistake they made. Each missed deadline, each angry client email, each financial slip felt like a personal vindication of the injustice I had endured. Meanwhile, my own career trajectory was climbing steadily. I had gained valuable experience with the competitor company that had recruited me, learning the intricacies of expansion, mergers, and acquisitions. Slowly, strategically, I was positioning myself to take on more responsibility, to ascend to a role that would eventually allow me to influence the fate of my parents' company directly. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about control and recognition. I wanted to demonstrate, not through words but through results, that I was capable, reliable, and indispensable, qualities my parents had failed to acknowledge. The moment that made everything concrete came during an industry conference. My parents' company was presenting a new product line, a desperate attempt to regain lost clients. I attended as part of my competitor role. Watching the presentation, I noticed glaring errors, miscalculations, poor planning, and an overall lack of vision. The disappointment on the faces of potential clients was palpable. And when a key client publicly questioned their ability to deliver, my parents stumbled, trying to provide assurances they couldn't back up. I left that conference with a strange mix of emotions: satisfaction, regret, and anticipation. I realized that the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the powerless child. I was now an insider in the company that could either save or absorb theirs. From that point, I began drafting plans, discreetly mapping out how I could approach the acquisition without alerting them too soon. Every financial report I analyzed, every operational weakness I identified, brought me closer to a moment that would define the next chapter of my life and theirs. And yet, the moral question lingered. Could I, in good conscience, step in and take over the company that my parents had built, knowing full well that my brother's incompetence and their favoritism had led it to ruin? Could I let them fail, knowing that doing nothing would effectively hand me control through circumstances they had created? Each night, I replayed their faces from the day they fired me, their dismissive words echoing in my mind. The line between justice and vengeance blurred, and I realized that the decision I faced wasn't just about business. It was about legacy, pride, and the meaning of family itself. By the time I reached my 5th year post-firing, the temptation of power had become almost unbearable. Every day, I had the chance to influence the future of the company my parents had built, a company that they had once promised would be my legacy. Now it was hanging by a thread, and I held the map to its salvation or its demise. I spent long nights poring over financial statements, internal reports, and client feedback that had somehow reached the competitor company. Each document revealed weaknesses that were both shocking and, in a twisted way, satisfying. I knew exactly where the mismanagement lay, what projects were doomed, which clients were on the verge of walking away. For the first time, I could see the entire landscape of their vulnerability, and it gave me a strange sense of control. The internal struggle, however, was harder to manage. I remembered my first years in the business, the countless hours I had spent trying to prove myself to my parents. I remembered the pride in their eyes when I secured a major client or successfully navigated a crisis. Part of me wanted to reach out to show them that I still cared, that I could save them. But another part of me, the part that had been burned so badly, whispered that they didn't deserve saving, that they had squandered the loyalty I had offered so freely, that my brother, the one who had coasted along while I did all the heavy lifting, should face the consequences of incompetence. This duality consumed me. Every morning, I would wake up with plans to either step in or stay back, and by nightfall I would be questioning my morality. I thought about confrontation, about returning to the office, about offering advice and expertise, but I knew it would be ignored. My parents had made their choice, and they had paid the price for it in their failing company. It was during this period that I realized just how much I had grown since being fired. I had built a career independent of them, developed strategic skills, and cultivated a network that made me indispensable in my new role. The competitor company I worked for trusted me, respected me, and relied on my judgment. The power I now held was intoxicating because it was hard-earned, not given by bloodline or favoritism. I started testing small maneuvers, quietly positioning myself closer to decision-making processes that could affect my parents' company. I asked questions that revealed insider knowledge, suggested strategies that might help clients, and subtly nudged discussions that highlighted weaknesses. I was careful, strategic, and methodical, never overstepping, never revealing my ultimate intentions. Meanwhile, news of my parents' ongoing struggles trickled in through industry chatter. A key supplier had pulled out due to unpaid invoices, a major client threatened legal action, and internal staff morale was at an all-time low. Each setback was like a puzzle piece falling into place, guiding me toward the moment where I would have the power to act decisively. And yet, the guilt lingered. I knew that stepping in too forcefully could destroy relationships permanently. I wasn't a vindictive person by nature, but the betrayal had altered me. I had to balance ambition with morality, vengeance with restraint. The line between right and wrong had never been so blurry. Every day I asked myself the same question: Could I truly save them if I wanted to? And if I could, should I? Or was the rightful course of action to let them face the consequences of their choices, allowing the empire they had built to crumble, only for me to guide its remnants toward something greater? The power to decide had never felt heavier. And for the first time, I realized that the answer to the question AITA might not come from anyone else. It would come from the choices I was about to make. By the 6th year after my firing, I had settled into a rhythm that balanced ambition with discretion. I was fully aware of my parents' company's vulnerabilities, and I had positioned myself in my competitor's organization in such a way that I could influence decisions without drawing attention. Every conversation, every report, every strategic recommendation I made was a careful step toward a larger plan, one that could either save or absorb the company that had once been my life. I began by analyzing every aspect of their operations. Their financial reports were a mess, cluttered with mismanaged budgets, overlooked expenses, and projects that had spiraled out of control. Client contracts were poorly structured, leaving them open to legal disputes. Employee morale was at rock bottom, and key staff had either left or were on the verge of quitting. It was a perfect storm of mismanagement, a storm they had created by ignoring competence in favor of favoritism. At the same time, I quietly cultivated relationships within my competitor company. I became the go-to person for advice on industry trends, risk assessments, and expansion opportunities. I learned how acquisitions worked from the inside, how to negotiate, how to identify weak points, how to structure deals in a way that maximized leverage. I never mentioned my parents' company outright, but I kept the possibility in mind, knowing that someday the knowledge I had could be used strategically. The moral conflict never left me. I spent nights imagining myself walking into my parents' office, offering guidance, taking control, and saving the business. But then I imagined the alternative, letting them fail, watching their empire crumble, and knowing that I had the power to step in as the CEO of the competitor company to guide the acquisition. The contrast between the two choices was stark, one rooted in loyalty and family, the other in justice, pride, and hard-earned power. I also monitored my brother from afar. He was struggling to hold the company together, trying to make decisions that were beyond his skill set. I saw him argue with clients, mismanage projects, and ignore advice from the remaining competent staff. He was drowning, and there was nothing I could or wanted to do to throw him a lifeline. The anger and resentment I felt toward him only grew stronger, solidifying my determination to follow through with my plan if necessary. During this time, I also reached out to industry contacts under the guise of networking. I subtly gathered intelligence about potential mergers and acquisitions, scouting opportunities to position myself as a key player. Every conversation I had, every meeting I attended, brought me closer to a point where I could act decisively. The pieces were falling into place, and I knew that soon, I would have the opportunity to make a choice that would define the next chapter of my life, and theirs. Yet the question of morality lingered. Could I justify letting them fail when I had the means to save them? Was it revenge to let my parents' mistakes dictate their downfall? Or was it merely the natural consequence of their decisions? Each night, I grappled with these questions, realizing that the answer would ultimately shape not just their fate, but mine as well. By the end of that year, the situation had reached a tipping point. Key clients had threatened to leave permanently, suppliers were demanding payment, and internal chaos was at an all-time high. The company was teetering on the edge, and I had all the information, all the influence, and all the power to decide whether it would survive or be absorbed into my growing competitor empire. The moment of truth was approaching, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The moment of truth arrived sooner than I expected. One morning, a high-level executive from my competitor company, someone I had been cultivating a professional rapport with, approached me with a confidential opportunity, the possibility of acquiring a struggling rival. My parents' company fit the description perfectly. It was teetering on the brink of collapse, and the acquisition could be structured in such a way that I would play a central role in the negotiations. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. This was the chance I had been waiting for, the moment where my knowledge, expertise, and patience could pay off. But at the same time, a heavy weight pressed on my conscience. This was my family. My parents, flawed and stubborn, had made catastrophic decisions, but they had once been my mentors, my role models. Could I really participate in a plan that might lead to their company being absorbed, essentially ending their legacy? I spent days analyzing the numbers, the contracts, the client lists, and the internal weaknesses I had meticulously tracked over the years. Every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. The company would not survive another year without intervention. And even if it did, my brother was incapable of stabilizing it long-term. It was a perfect storm of incompetence, and I had the ability to steer it toward a decisive outcome. I also considered the personal dynamics. My parents were proud people, and their pride often prevented them from acknowledging mistakes. Any direct help from me might be dismissed or misunderstood. On the other hand, my influence within the competitor company gave me a unique position. I could make strategic moves without ever revealing my hand directly. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the choice before me was as much about power as it was about justice. I began laying the groundwork carefully. I positioned myself in key strategy meetings, subtly guiding discussions about potential acquisitions toward my parents' company. I highlighted industry trends, operational weaknesses, and market opportunities, without ever explicitly naming the target. It was a delicate dance, enough to ensure that the acquisition would make sense to decision-makers, but careful enough to keep my personal connection concealed. Meanwhile, news of my parents' continued struggles reached me daily. I could see the cracks widening. Client complaints were escalating, staff turnover was accelerating, and internal projects were failing catastrophically. My brother's desperation was becoming apparent. He was making increasingly rash decisions, panicking over financial shortfalls, and alienating the few competent employees who remained. As the acquisition plan began to solidify within my competitor company, I felt a strange combination of satisfaction and unease. I was about to wield the power that had been denied to me for so long, yet I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I might be crossing a line. This wasn't just business strategy, it was family. And for the first time in years, I realized how tangled morality and ambition could become. I couldn't stop thinking about the day I was fired. My parents' cold, dismissive words still echoed in my mind, and the contrast between my brother's effortless ascension and my own struggle fueled a quiet but persistent anger. It was a stark reminder of why I was in this position and why I felt justified in my actions. And so, with the first strategic moves quietly underway, I prepared for the next phase. Direct negotiations, detailed proposals, and the confrontation that would finally put my parents' company, and my family's pride, squarely in my hands. I knew that once the process began, there would be no turning back. The question of whether I was the asshole would be answered not in words, but in actions. The day of the first official negotiation arrived, and I felt a tension I hadn't experienced in years. This was it, the point where years of planning, observation, and strategic positioning would collide with the reality of my parents' company. I walked into the room representing my competitor company, documents in hand, heart racing, mind calculating every possible outcome. My parents were there, flanked by my brother, their faces a mixture of disbelief and cautious pride. They didn't recognize me as the negotiator in front of them. To them, I was still the child who had been cast aside, the one who had been unworthy of leadership. Their confidence in my brother was evident, but so was the desperation masked behind their polished expressions. I began the negotiation carefully, presenting numbers, operational analyses, and market evaluations. I highlighted potential risks and inefficiencies, not in a way that would humiliate them, but enough to illustrate the reality of their situation. My brother fumbled, unable to respond to pointed questions about budget allocations or client retention strategies. My parents tried to interject, but it was clear that the weight of incompetence had left them vulnerable. Throughout the discussion, I fought an internal battle. Part of me wanted to offer subtle advice, to guide them through the conversation and save them from a disastrous outcome. Another part of me, fueled by years of resentment and the sting of betrayal, wanted to let the chips fall where they may. Could I step in and rescue them? Or was their downfall a consequence they had earned through favoritism and mismanagement? The negotiations dragged on for hours. Every point I made, Every document I presented felt like a tightrope walk between strategy and morality. I had to balance the interests of my company, the expectations of my superiors, and the remnants of familial loyalty. Watching my parents stumble, struggling to defend their choices, was both satisfying and painful. The irony was not lost on me. They had once dismissed my competence, and now their fate depended on the very skills they had ignored. By the end of the day, it became clear that an agreement would likely go through. My parents' company was too weak to negotiate favorable terms, and my competitor company had the upper hand. I left the room with a mix of triumph and unease. I had played my role perfectly, ensuring that the acquisition would succeed while keeping my personal connection concealed. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. That night, I replayed every moment of the negotiation in my mind. My father's furrowed brow, my mother's strained smile, my brother's fumbling attempts to justify decisions. They were etched into my memory. I realized that while I had gained power and influence, the cost was emotional as well as moral. The line between justice and vengeance had blurred beyond recognition. I began to understand that being the asshole wasn't defined by business strategy. It was defined by the choices I was making with family, loyalty, and pride. Every action I took would have consequences not just for the company, but for the relationships that had once defined my life. And yet, despite the guilt, a part of me reveled in the realization that I had finally become the person I had always been capable of being. The strategist, the decision-maker, the one who held the power they had denied me. The first negotiation was just the beginning. What followed would test my patience, my morals, and the very definition of what it meant to be family. I was about to discover whether justice, ambition, and revenge could coexist, or if one would ultimately consume the others. After the initial negotiation, the reality of the situation began to settle in for my parents. They were no longer the untouchable rulers of their company. They were exposed, vulnerable, and facing a fate they hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new pressures. Urgent emails from worried clients, missed deadlines, and internal staff conflicts. Their once solid reputation was crumbling before their eyes, and I watched from the sidelines, carefully calculating every move. Despite my power, I still felt conflicted. I could intervene, guide them through the storm, and ensure their company survived. I could use my insider knowledge to fix the mistakes they had made over the years. But every time I considered it, I remembered the cold dismissal, the favoritism toward my brother, and the years I had spent being overlooked. Could I really save them after everything? Meanwhile, my parents were making mistakes at a rapid pace. They were reactive instead of proactive, scrambling to address problems without understanding the root causes. My brother, panicked and overwhelmed, made impulsive decisions that worsened the situation. The more they floundered, the more obvious it became. Without external intervention, the company would fail. And I was in a unique position to decide whether that intervention would come or not. Within my competitor company, I began positioning myself for the next stage of the acquisition. I worked behind the scenes, ensuring that every meeting, every report, and every recommendation would push the acquisition forward without revealing my personal connection. My strategy was precise. I would remain neutral in appearance, but I would control the outcome entirely. At the same time, the emotional weight of the situation was becoming harder to bear. I thought about my parents, the people who had given me life, and how far our relationship had fractured. I thought about my brother, who had never worked as hard as I had, now facing the consequences of his laziness and incompetence. And I thought about myself, standing at the crossroads of morality and ambition, unsure of whether my actions would define me as righteous or cruel. I began to notice a subtle shift in my parents' behavior. They were starting to panic, questioning decisions that had once seemed obvious. Their confidence in my brother was eroding, and they were beginning to seek advice from anyone who seemed competent. Ironically, their desperation made them more predictable, more vulnerable to strategic manipulation, and I realized that the power I had carefully built over the years was now at its peak. Each day, the tension grew. Internal staff conflicts escalated, clients demanded reassurances, and financial pressures mounted. My parents' pride prevented them from asking for help directly, but the signs of distress were undeniable. It was as if the universe had conspired to place me in this exact position, the only person with the ability to influence the outcome. And yet, the question lingered: should I act to save them, or should I let the natural consequences of their decisions play out? Every scenario I ran in my head was morally complex. Saving them would mean forgiving past betrayals and prioritizing family over justice. Allowing them to fail would feel like revenge, but it could also be seen as a necessary reckoning. As the week progressed, I realized that the moment of decision was fast approaching. The acquisition process would soon become irreversible, and once I made my move, there would be no going back. I would either step in as the savior or remain a silent observer as their empire crumbled. The weight of the choice pressed heavily on me, and I knew that the answer to AITA would be determined not by my intentions, but by the consequences of my actions. The day finally came when the choice could no longer be postponed. My parents' company was on the brink of collapse. Key clients had officially begun withdrawing contracts, suppliers were threatening legal action, and internal chaos had reached a point where recovery without outside intervention was virtually impossible. I had the power to step in and save them, or let the acquisition proceed under my competitor company, effectively giving me control over the remnants of their empire. Sitting in my office, reviewing the final reports, I felt a strange calm. Every detail had been analyzed, every risk assessed, and every potential outcome considered. The power to decide was entirely in my hands. I thought about my parents, the people who had shaped my early years, who had fired me despite my years of loyalty. I thought about my brother, who had coasted on privilege while I worked tirelessly. And I thought about myself, the person I had become, capable, strategic, and ultimately in control. I imagined two paths. One was the path of forgiveness and intervention. Stepping in, advising my parents, helping them stabilize their company, and saving their legacy. It would require swallowing my pride, overlooking past betrayals, and prioritizing family over justice. The other path was the path of consequence. Allowing the acquisition to proceed, watching their empire crumble under the weight of their mistakes, and ensuring that I emerged as the leader in the company that would absorb theirs. It was a cold, calculated choice, but one that felt just. After hours of reflection, I realized that my decision had less to do with revenge and more to do with acknowledgement. My parents had dismissed my contributions, underestimated my abilities, and favored my brother despite clear incompetence. Letting the acquisition proceed wasn't cruelty, it was recognition of reality. The company they had built, without the guidance it truly needed, was unsustainable. And I, for better or worse, had the knowledge and power to shape its next chapter. When I finally announced my recommendation to the board, I did so with precision and clarity. I outlined the strategic benefits of acquiring my parents' company, the operational weaknesses that would require immediate attention, and the opportunities for integration under our leadership. I spoke as a professional, without revealing my personal connection. There was no vindictiveness in my tone, only truth, strategy, and the cold clarity of someone who had prepared for this moment for years. The acquisition was approved. My parents' company would be absorbed into our competitors' operations, with me positioned to lead the transition. When the news reached them, there was shock, disbelief, and, eventually, a begrudging acknowledgement of reality. My father's pride prevented him from expressing gratitude. My mother's disappointment was palpable, and my brother's resentment simmered beneath the surface. I had won not through confrontation, but through strategy, patience, and the undeniable weight of evidence. That night, I sat alone, reflecting on what had happened. I had achieved what I had set out to do: assert my value, demonstrate my competence, and establish control over a situation that had once rendered me powerless. Yet, the moral questions lingered. Was I the asshole? I hadn't sought revenge, but I hadn't intervened to save them either. I had allowed their decisions to dictate their fate, and in doing so, I had claimed what I had rightfully earned: recognition, respect, and power. In the end, I realized that AITA wasn't determined by actions alone, but by perspective. To my parents, I might appear ruthless. To my brother, I was the enemy. But to myself, I was simply acknowledging reality, honoring my own worth, and stepping into the life I had been building long before they had dismissed me. The decision was mine, and the consequences theirs to bear. The dust settled slowly. My parents' company was officially absorbed, integrated into our operations, and under my leadership. The transition was smooth, too smooth in some ways, because the company had been weakened by years of mismanagement, and my strategic planning filled the gaps seamlessly. My team praised the efficiency of the integration, clients were reassured, and suppliers adjusted to the new management structure without major disruption. From a professional standpoint, it was a success. But the personal ramifications were more complicated. My parents were silent, their pride wounded beyond repair. My father avoided eye contact, offering curt nods instead of conversation. My mother's disappointment was palpable. She never admitted her mistakes, but the resignation in her demeanor was clear. My brother was furious, lashing out in subtle ways, questioning my decisions, and blaming me for ruining the family legacy. It was ironic. He had done little to preserve it, yet he felt entitled to mourn its collapse. Despite the tension, I felt a strange peace. I had proven my worth, claimed the recognition I had been denied for so long, and assumed a role that matched my skills and ambitions. The years of betrayal, frustration, and being overlooked had shaped me into someone capable of extraordinary strategic thinking, and now the world could see it. I had transformed injustice into opportunity, and while the victory was bittersweet, it was undeniably mine. There were quiet moments of reflection where the moral weight hit hardest. Could I have intervened differently? Could I have saved them without sacrificing my pride? I thought about the alternative life I could have led, one where forgiveness and loyalty guided my actions rather than strategy and consequence. But I realized that the path I had chosen wasn't purely about vengeance. It was about acknowledgement. My parents had dismissed my value, underestimated me, and elevated my brother in spite of merit. Allowing the acquisition to proceed was a logical outcome, not a petty act of revenge. Friends and colleagues had their opinions, of course. Some admired my professionalism and strategic acumen, recognizing that I had acted with skill and precision. Others whispered that I had been ruthless, that family loyalty should have guided my decisions. I understood both perspectives, but ultimately, the question of whether I was the asshole didn't belong to anyone else, it belonged to me. I thought about the future. My parents would have to rebuild their personal lives outside the business. My brother would have to confront the consequences of his choices. And I would continue to lead, using the lessons of the past to shape a stronger, more resilient company. The power I now held was not just financial. It was a testament to perseverance, skill, and the ability to navigate moral complexity. In the end, the story wasn't just about business or betrayal. It was about recognition, justice, and the nuanced choices that define who we are. I had been underestimated, dismissed, and betrayed, but I had emerged not only intact, but stronger, smarter, and in control. I had done what I believed was right given the circumstances, and while some might label me ruthless, others might see only the truth. That sometimes loyalty is earned, respect is deserved, and the consequences of choices, both good and bad, must be faced head-on. So here I am, having walked a tightrope between morality and ambition, questioning myself endlessly, and yet knowing one thing for certain. I acted with purpose, clarity, and an unshakable understanding of my own worth. AITA? Maybe to some. But to me, I finally claimed the recognition I had been denied for too long, and that, in itself, was priceless.